The war in Ukraine is now reaching a very interesting point in its development, where we are now reaching a point where the war has been going on for so long that the underlying strengths and weaknesses of each respective system of government and each respective society are beginning to shine through. And when we look back at this conflict from a historical perspective, no doubt we will see many trends that make this point of the war look inevitable in hindsight, but that as the war was beginning, not a lot of people realized. And really what we are seeing at this point in the war in Ukraine is Russia is getting inherently weaker with each passing day, while Ukraine is getting increasingly stronger with each passing day, especially from a technological standpoint, where now Ukraine seems to be racing ahead technologically, really outpacing Russia, something they've been doing throughout the entire war, but now the pace of their advances is increasing much faster than Russia's advances are. Ukraine has been coming out with a lot of new technologies lately, and each of these new technologies has been shaping the battlefield. We're talking about everything from Flamingo cruise missiles to Interceptor drones, which might not seem very innovative from a technological standpoint, but are very innovative from a warfare standpoint and how they are being used to address the actual situation on the battlefield today. Ukraine is also developing a lot of new technologies that are reaching phases where they are getting more mature. We're talking about AI-powered drones that can act autonomously of their operators if they get cut off. We're also talking about on-the-ground robotics, where Ukraine is actually able to use waves of robots and waves of drones to take positions independently of their infantry and then send infantry in to clean it up. The AI drones and the ground robotics are still in the early stages, but Ukraine is far ahead of Russia, and they're having some very interesting trials that make these technologies look a lot more viable than a lot of people have given them credit for. At the same time, Russia seems to not really be innovating all that much. They are, in some cases, matching the innovations that Ukraine is bringing, especially where it's easy to match those innovations. But for the most part, Russia is not really bringing a whole lot of new stuff to bear on the battlefield. They are just matching what Ukraine is doing. And this, I want to propose to you, is actually much more interesting than it even seems on the surface. Because I want to propose to you that what we are seeing in the war in Ukraine right now is not something new. It is actually something that has played out many times throughout history, and at least two major times in the past century, where we see how democracies are inherently superior to dictatorships, or governments that are more inclusive of average people in society, even if they are not full democracies, are inherently superior to governments that are less inclusive, that are more centralized, and where there are less opportunities for average people. And it is these governing structures and the underlying strengths and weaknesses of them that I would propose to you are why Ukraine is racing ahead while Russia is falling very far behind. I want to start this analysis, first of all, with a very specific example to prove my point and show how Ukraine's innovation will very soon eclipse anything that Russia can produce, and that this rate of innovation will ultimately be what probably wins Ukraine the war. And then once I do that, I will be prepared to show you other examples of the same thing happening throughout history, and I can prove to you that this is because Ukraine is a freer society than Russia is. And that has a lot of implications, not just for how we predict the outcomes of geopolitical conflicts in the future, but also for how we vote and try to orchestrate our own societies back at home. So the very specific example I want to use is Ukraine's new Interceptor drones, which on the surface might not seem all that special, but they are actually a rather brilliant innovation. These Interceptor drones are something I've talked about before, but basically they are a very affordable drone that is capable of very consistently intercepting more expensive Russian drones that enter into Ukraine's airspace. Ukraine has realized that Russia's new tactic is to basically attack Ukrainian cities with large waves of drones, not to attack Ukraine on the front line, but rather to attack Ukraine on the home front, basically to terrorize them. And Ukraine has been able to very rapidly respond to this change in Russian strategy by coming up with a technology very quickly that counters Russia's strategy, and very soon we will see Interceptor drones doing just that. Where Ukraine can, for the cost of, around $1,000, and even if several of these fail, maybe for a couple $1,000s, take out Russian drones that cost many multiples of that amount. And this is basically allowing Ukraine to defeat Russia in a war of attrition, where it is going to be too expensive for Russia to defeat Ukraine over the long term because it is more affordable for Ukraine to defend itself. Now, there's obviously a lot of aspects of this to analyze, but the most important points for this video is that Ukraine's response has been technologically advanced, it has been very rapid, and it has been malleable to the actual conditions on the battlefield where they can change direction, change course rather quickly. And importantly, this is very different than what we've seen from Russia, for example. And this is not the first example of this. Early on in the war, we saw Ukraine innovating with drones, and obviously this is something that Russia ultimately matched, but it's not something that Russia matched right away. When Ukraine first introduced drones to the battlefield, Russia's response was to mock them, make fun of them, and to continue sending large waves of tanks, infantry, and armored vehicles. And ultimately, the drones ended up eliminating the tanks, the armored vehicles, and the infantry. And it was only after a lot of these had largely been eliminated that Russia finally reached the point much later in the war, comparatively, where they were innovating with drones of their own. At this point, Ukraine then brought their own drone advancements, and Russia matched those a little bit later, and this is the trend that we have seen throughout the war, where Ukraine innovates very quickly, and Russia always lags a little bit behind them. Up to this point in the war, that has prevented Russia literally from pushing forward, and it will probably continue to do so. But what a lot of people miss is that over time, these technological wedges grow. And the underlying reasons for why they exist grow. And we're now reaching a point where Ukraine's advantages over Russia could become catastrophic, and Ukraine's advantages over Russia could actually ultimately deny Russia from being able to reach the next rung quickly enough. So when we look at the Interceptor drones, for example, rather soon Ukraine will probably be able to stop the waves of Russian drones that are coming over their territory because Ukraine's Interceptor drones are ready. They're working. All they have to do is ramp up production and ramp up distribution. Whereas Russia, because they were so late to respond to the fact that Ukraine was doing drone strikes on their territory, they are developing Interceptor drones, but they are still in the very early prototype phases. That means we're probably going to come to a point in this war where Ukraine can bombard Russian territory rather freely, where Russia cannot do the same to Ukrainian territory. And while Ukraine has this advantage, they'll be able to do things, for example, take out electronics facilities, electronics factories, things that they're already doing, that will slow down Russia's rate of advance. And ultimately, Russia might not be able to advance to Interceptor drones fast enough to actually have a chance to continue winning the war because their infrastructure might be so devastated by the time they get there. Now, obviously, that specific scenario that I've just laid out is a little bit speculative. We don't yet know what the future holds because we can't, even if things seem to be pointing in a certain direction. But what we can say for certain is that Ukraine is innovating faster than Russia is, and that in the past, in major conflicts, it was exactly that kind of trend that led the world to where it is today. And the most notable example of this is the Cold War. If you've ever read the book Chip War, which is a fascinating book for a lot of different reasons, one of the scenarios that that book lays out is why the Americans ultimately won the Cold War instead of the Soviet Union. And a large reason the Americans won the Cold War was because they innovated in semiconductors much faster than the Soviets did. At first, the Soviets were doing quite well in semiconductor technology, especially when the technology was at its infancy. But Americans started developing their chips much faster than the Soviets did, and that was because they had a democracy and they had a capitalist market, which gave people an incentive to innovate in semiconductors and innovate in chips that the Soviets didn't have. It also provided them with a lot of capital to help fund their research. Essentially, the United States began putting out nuclear missiles with much better targeting systems than the Soviet Union had. The small semiconductors meant that at a light payload, the United States could reliably hit the specific target that they were aiming for, whereas the Soviet Union, they could only hit targets within a certain range. They weren't nearly as precise. That gave the Soviet Union a disadvantage when it came to nuclear warfare. The United States could always, whenever they wanted to, put a nuclear missile right smack dab in the middle of the Kremlin, right in the middle of Moscow, whereas the Soviets could not reliably, for example, hit the White House. It wasn't the only factor that ended the Cold War, but it was a large one, and again, you can read more about that in the book Chip War. Now, where this becomes really relevant for Russia's war against Ukraine is that the underlying reasons that the United States ultimately won in that technological arms race are precisely the same reasons that Ukraine is winning their technological arms race against Russia today. And the pattern is also the same, where the gap at first starts out looking really small, but because there's an innovative advantage on one side, the gap becomes exponentially larger over time, meaning it gets larger at a faster rate. And we're seeing exactly that today. Early on in the Cold War, as I mentioned, the Soviets looked to be, somewhat on par with the United States when it came to semiconductors because that technology was in its infancy. It was just the basics that had to be mastered. As innovation began to get ramped up, though, the Soviets very quickly fell behind, and they kind of regressed in this specific technology to sending over spies to steal the secrets of the United States. But because semiconductors were getting to the point where the technology was doubling in effectiveness every single year, by the time the Soviets stole the technology and by the time they could actually, start producing the technology with a high enough quality, which they never really could, because that was a whole battle in and of itself, the United States already had chips that were miles ahead of where they were. And as time went on, the Soviets fell further and further and further behind, even though at first they started out where it seemed to be on par. There's a couple reasons that the United States was getting so far ahead and the Soviets regressed to just copying, but the main reasons were due to the underlying natures of the societies. As we all know, the Soviets were able to come up with some really good, strong innovations. We look at Sputnik, for example. We look at rockets and the fact that the Soviets early on seemed to be winning the space race. But then, of course, the United States ultimately won that too. And what we realize is that a society like the Soviet Union, that is very centralized, can be very good at carrying out a hyper-specific objective that is handed down from the top. But they are very bad at reacting to how things are going in real time. Now, the reason these societies are so bad at reacting is because of the way the incentives are stacked up. And a more democratic society where people can enjoy the fruits of their labors, where they can own intellectual property, and they can actually get rich by developing and innovating, they obviously have a much bigger incentive to go out and do that. Whereas in a society like the Soviet Union, people may be driven by national pride, they may be driven by ideology or a number of other reasons, but ultimately their drive is coming from the top down, telling them to build something rather than having an incentive in and of themselves to just build and create for its own sake. And there is, something really interesting about innovation, where a lot of the best innovation tends to come from startups. And the reason that it tends to come from startups is because as people become successful and they become more wealthy, they tend to get stuck in their ways. And this is just a trend with older people in general. The older you are, the more successful you are, the more you're stuck in your ways. Whereas younger people are more able to see the world through a kind of a new lens. So when you look at a society like modern Russia today and you compare that to Ukraine, you see some huge differences. What a lot of people don't realize is that in modern Russia, there is actually an active disincentive to innovate. Because the country is ruled by oligarchs and because it is ruled in such a mafia style. When we look at the birth of the Russian Federation, there were basically mafia wars to decide who would control which resources. And these people would use force to steal other people's property, whether that be intellectual property, whether that be the right to mine and extract certain minerals, oil, gas, you name it. And so in modern Russia, there is a reason that they are a largely extractive economy that focuses on these resources because these are the resources that are the easiest for the oligarchs to control with the wealth that they have. For your average Russian person, it's not that there's zero innovation in Russia, but for your average Russian person, there is not as much incentive to innovate because a lot of people fear that if they're successful, that could be the worst possible thing for them. Think, for example, if you lived in a city that was ruled by the mafia, what would you rather do? Would you rather have a job and just live a normal life and stay off the mafia's radar? Or would you rather start a successful business that then sends the mafia to come knocking on your door asking for their cut, and in the process, maybe they hurt your family? This actively squashes innovation And because the oligarchs already control everything and they are so wealthy from the system as it exists, for example, with the older, more archaic weapons systems, their only incentive to innovate is after they realize that they are actively being defeated. At first, they actually have an incentive to not innovate because producing more weapons is actually better for them. They personally make more money. And that might be part of the reason we saw the trends early in the war where Russia failed to innovate as quickly until they realized that they were just being totally defeated. In a society like Ukraine, where there is much more entrepreneurship, it's much freer, there is better protection of intellectual property, and people feel that there's also better protection of their personal wealth if they earn it. These people are going to go out and try to innovate from the get-go because there is money to be made. This trend is then why we see Ukraine defeating Russia in every important way, when it comes to drones, when it comes to AI, when it comes to robotics, and other things of the sort. A lot of people, though, they have a strong reaction to this, and they'll say, well, isn't this just war profiteering to see this need and go in and make money off of it? And the answer to that is maybe in some cases, but not typically. The perspective we need to have is that this isn't war profiteering, but rather that this is entrepreneurship that is profiting from developing the technology that your society needs the most. And if you're a society like Ukraine that is being attacked, the technology that your society needs the most is unfortunately weapons. These people who are working to develop these weapons, if their country was not at war, they otherwise might use their efforts to develop a different category of technology, but that's not what their country needs right now. And so that's not what will be as rewarded. And here we see a strength of a democratic society, and actually a strength where the ability to earn money from a war can actually be a positive thing for a society, when, with the caveat, when your country is the one being attacked and you need to benefit your society by giving them weapons that help them to protect themselves and to preserve lives. With this perspective, we can compare Russia and Ukraine in a very interesting way. If you're an 18-year-old in Russia versus Ukraine, and you are looking out at the world and the best way to construct your life for the most financial benefit, which is something that people do in all societies, it might be very natural for you to look at the conflict that your country is currently in as one avenue to do that. And the way that that is done in either country is very telling. In Ukraine, if you want to help solve your country's biggest problem, which is the war, and you want to be rewarded for that and make money in the process, you go and you think really hard and you study and you try to develop technology and develop companies that will help protect and preserve more lives at home. If you're a Russian, you simply go to the closest recruiting office and you volunteer to get a military signing bonus, to get a high military salary, and a high death benefit if you pass away. These are two people who are looking at the same conflict. They are both making money from it, which is not inherently a bad thing, but in many cases it can be or not be. It depends on the underlying motives. One of these people is developing technology that is advancing their society, their economy further. One of them is just allowing themselves to be used as a weapon by their state. And one of them is progressing a society. One of them is actively dragging down a society and using up the few resources that it has. And it's pretty clear which of these is the superior approach in a long, drawn-out conflict, and for the long term, for the health of that society. Now, in each of these choices, you can again see how the underlying societal structure leads to the 18-year-olds feeling that these are their respective options. And a societal structure that is more democratic, more open, more free market, where you're going to be rewarded for your efforts, people are more inclined in a certain direction. In a societal structure where everything is owned by the oligarchs, your only question is, what is the best way for me to get those oligarchs to pay me the highest salary? Innovation never even crosses your mind. This then has become a huge problem for Russia, because the oligarchs, the only ones who had the true profit incentive, had the incentive to keep things as they were. Because they kept things as they were for too long, they did not innovate fast enough, and Ukraine got the competitive, innovative advantage. And even if these oligarchs now realize their error and try to flip the switch and go in the other direction, they're still not going to be able to catch up to Ukraine. Not only because Ukraine is ahead of them already, But because of the underlying factors, those don't change overnight. You cannot manufacture internal drive. You cannot manufacture internal desire, internal commitment, or any of those things, especially in a society that you specifically constructed so that people would look to you for opportunities rather than looking for ways to lift up society as a whole. This then is probably where we get to our major takeaways, which I hope will be actually really insightful. First and foremost, we looked at two major examples of two societies that have failed to innovate fast enough and therefore have potentially collapsed because of that. The Soviet Union and potentially modern Russia. And what is interesting about this is that these are two societies with two different underlying societal structures, two different extremes of, for example, the political spectrum. Here in the United States, a lot of the arguments I've made in this video are very well known when it comes to arguing against communism. When you have communism and everybody gets the same, there are not enough incentives to innovate, and therefore the society falls behind. That is well known to people. But people forget that that same risk exists on the other side of the spectrum, where you have a dictatorship, a society where all of the wealth gets too much accumulated in the hands of too few people, and how that structure actually doesn't create innovation, it actually stifles innovation. When you have too much wealth in the hands of too few people, it creates a societal structure where people start to look to those people for opportunities because they don't think that they can actually be successful if they go out to innovate for themselves. And so when you have societies like the United States that have been very successful capitalistic societies, but increasingly the wealth gets into the hands of fewer people, increasingly those people are able to use that wealth to influence votes and orchestrate the society in a way that builds more wealth for them and creates less opportunities for other people. The inherent risks are the same, even if they're not to the same degree as those in communism that we always talk about avoiding. And so we realize here that the real problem isn't just the underlying political system, it's what that underlying political system does. And what that underlying political system does that creates these problems is that it removes the motive for innovation. It removes the desire for innovation. And there's more than one way to do that. And there's more than one of these extremes to avoid. If you want to learn more about that particular topic, it's really fascinating. You can see it all across history, not just in the modern day. There is a really good book that discusses that. It's called Why Nations Fail. I will leave an affiliate link to that in the description because why not? It's been one of my favorite books that I've read this year, and it has helped to inform a lot of the details that I've brought out in this video. It didn't bring out those details specifically, but it is what taught me to think in this way and to recognize these patterns as they happen in the modern day. And I think that is the best kind of education, when you learn a pattern from the past and you can then apply that pattern to the modern day. That is something I am constantly doing on this channel when it comes to the war against Ukraine. I hope you found that helpful. I hope you found this video helpful in understanding how the war in Ukraine is going. If you did, would you please like this video and subscribe to the channel? Those things are both completely free, but they help me out a lot. And if you want to help support the channel even more, there are a number of links in the description by which you can do so. It's completely voluntary, but it really does help keep these videos going and helps increase the quality of the videos and everything like that. Thank you so much to my supporters, and I'll see you guys all on the next video.